I want to address the issue of the, the so-called UFO phenomenon. Um, uh, I seem to always get drug into this discussion on the space show, and so I thought I'd kind of give a little bit of my attitude and perspective on the subject. Um, now, I would say that historically, of course, when I was in grade school and maybe high school, I had a casual interest in the subject. Um, but I think Mr. Philip Klass um, uh, wrote a book, a debunking book that kind of persuaded me that a lot of the unexplained things that I took as credible were actually due to a weird ball lightning phenomenon. I think the truth of the matter is during that period, I would say I'm kind of the opposite of Fox Mulder. I didn't want to believe because I think I still feel the idea that if we're in direct contact with an advanced civilization, things may not go so well for us. I mean, the idea that they're going to be inherently benevolent is, to me, a little bit dubious. And the fact of the matter is, they could do very destructive things without even intending to. After all, I don't believe that, for instance, the people that came from Europe, well, maybe in the Spanish South American experience was more that way, but in the North American experience, I don't think they came with great hostility. It's just that one thing led to another, and well, you see what the fate of the Native American was there. So I think it's similar kind of idea that at least that's the way I thought at the time, and there didn't seem to be overwhelming evidence, and I remember that there were a variety of predictions that were made by certain people that didn't seem to be coming true, that they would eventually make contact, and they didn't. And then, of course, the Condon report came out that claimed that there was nothing there or whatever. At least that's the way it was perceived by me in high school. So I did have a roommate at my freshman year in college that was really into the subject, so I definitely overheard and encountered a lot of information about it, of which I was still somewhat dismissive. Um, and so that represents most of my attitude. Um, I mean, I was fairly familiar with a lot of the subjects, and I know I found the TV series The Mid-90s Dark Skies to be a great comedy, is the way I saw it, where they had all this UFO lore drawn into a show, taking it very verbatim, literally, and making a show out of it, and everything in history that was happening practically that somehow the UFOs were involved in everything from the Kennedy assassination to why Howard Hughes went insane and so forth. So that kind of gives you the kind of a background of where I am on the subject. And so what changed the whole thing for me was, I would say, is when I read the book by Leslie Kean, the UFOs, pilots and generals, and government officials go on the record. What really was captivating me was the idea that John Podesta, chief of staff to President Clinton and top aide to President Obama, uh, was actually openly writing a pro-UFO position. And I was really totally unaware of his previous statements on it. Again, it just shows how little I paid to the subject. I mean, I was aware there was a disclosure thing, but it was overwhelmed by 9/11, and that just wasn't my thing. Um, and so, like I said, that kind of captivated my interest, but only very slowly. In fact, I bought the book when Borders Books was going out of business for $3 or something, and set it on a stack of books I hadn't read until a Christmas vacation after that, where I said, well, okay, good time to read that book. And so I did, and really was kind of taken in that, hey, there really are some good quality cases there. And the fact that it's sort of, I evolved into studying it a little bit more and started looking into more information. Um, uh, One thing that was quite interesting to me was the Twining memo when I came across that, where you had the general who was in charge of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the time of the Roswell incident. And he's writing a memo in response to another general in the Pentagon's request about what's the situation on this flying saucer subject. I think is what they called it at the time, or flying disc. And he basically says this is something real and not fictitious or visionary, and goes on to describe what they are and so on and so forth, and requests that a code word classified study be created to evaluate the situation, which led to Project Sign, which reputedly had concluded that these things were, in the words of the time, interplanetary. I think extraterrestrial would be what the word we use today. I don't think anybody believes they originate from within the solar system. But the point is that kind of gives you the background of this subject. Then I got deeper into it. I read the Dolan books on UFOs and the National Security State as 2-volume set, which do a lot of detailed analysis and description of cases over a period of decades. And you come to realize there's a lot of evidence for it. When you look into the Conan report, you realize it really was a whitewash, that there were a lot of really high quality unexplained cases that are in the report but are really ignored in this executive summary. And so, like I said, it's a series of things like that that have led me to the conclusion that there is some there. And then, of course, we now have the very recent Tic Tac UFO events from the Navy, the 3 videos that came out, the revelation of ATIP and so forth, which only confirms and reinforces the attitude I'd actually had before that came out, that there is something real to these phenomena, and they appear to be something physical and tangible. Now, on the other hand, and I want to emphasize this, from my background in studying physics, I understand just how far out interstellar travel is. I mean, the energy it takes to get to any reasonable speed is something astounding. Let's look at it this way. In my youth, a lot of us focused about the whole Einstein speed of light limit, and that's being portrayed as being this great barrier to interstellar travel. But the practical fact is, even if Newtonian physics ruled, and yet we still could get all the energy we might want out of nuclear fusion, we still would be hard-pressed to engage in interstellar travel. I mean, getting above a few percent of the speed of light is incredibly challenging, even if we had a mature fusion-powered spacecraft. And I've done some, analysis of this sort of thing, and it's, very difficult to get to these high speeds. In addition to which, at those speeds, you encounter the stray gas particles that are in interstellar space, and those collisions start taking on the form of radiation, actually. If you look at this, at the kind of energy levels you get out of nuclear reactions and the particles that are emitted from it, such as neutrons and so forth, you're encountering protons and electrons, in this case, at those similar energies, which will impact on the craft and create X-ray radiation and so forth. In addition, of course, the heavy nuclei and all the cosmic radiation issues we already been discussing as threats to interplanetary travel. So, in other words, interstellar travel is a quite challenging thing on a real physics, known physics basis. Given also looking at analysis of, as discussed in the show, I'm attaching this to, using the Drake equation, yes, the likelihood of 2 civilizations at a relatively high level being close enough to each other, to be within a few light years apart, so that we could have events such as in the Star Trek series where we meet these other civilizations and have political relationships with them and wars and conflicts and negotiations and that sort of thing on a routine basis, is sort of out of the question, really. At least it would seem to be that way. The one missing element, I think, was discussed late in the show, but it is true. We don't know how long an advanced civilization will last, and it would only take a small percent of the ones that develop in cosmic time to find a way of surviving, to perhaps change the dynamic on the possibility of an encounter, which will leave us with a possibility that if we are being visited by some extraterrestrials, they are probably incredibly advanced. They obviously aren't just at the level of what we would think of with known physics of traveling between stars at a very multi-generational level or something like that. It would seem that they would be very advanced in some ways. And that would run up against the issue of the Einstein speed of light limit and how could they possibly do it and so forth. So in other words, and the other question, of course, is I guess if they were here, why are they behaving in the way they're behaving, not making contact and so forth. Another issue that would be probably raised. So I understand all these objections to the subject. And nevertheless, if in fact it actually is occurring, then you have to, throw out the theory and get down to the actual hard data reality. And the question is, though, the public sort of has soft data, but a lot of it. Okay, so the real question comes down to, did events such as the Roswell crash and other similar events in the early 50s, particularly, did they actually occur, or are they simply mythologies? And that's an interesting question. I mean, what we do know that something happened at Roswell in the summer of 1947. And we know that it was enough to at least initially fool the base intelligence officer and the base commander to say that they had a flying disc, only to have it later refuted very shortly thereafter and claimed to be a weather balloon. There's certainly rampant rumors that existed among the population of the town. And of course, Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut who did get involved in this subject later, of course, emanates from that town. So he was obviously very knowledgeable about this tradition, I think, well before he ever became public with the subject, or before, the late 70s, early 80s discussion of Roswell became a hot topic. And I think that's interesting in and of itself. But there's also a variety of rumors, including General Exum, who was at the time a more junior officer at Wright-Patterson, who talks about what was perception at the time at the base and so forth. So there seems to be some evidence that something really may have occurred there. And there's a variety of other incidents that have been purported. And I'm not going to go into the details of all these things, but there seems to be a background that the government may know something about it and have been covering it up. And for instance, the Roswell incident itself suggests that that was effectively contained for nearly 30 years for practical purposes, which shows that they do have a very good capability of keeping the lid on things when they want to. Probably because the number of people involved are relatively limited. They probably had high security clearances and were probably pretty established members of the national security community. The other thing I looked at on the subject was, well, what about the careers of the people? I mean, this base commander who put out this erroneous thing that he had a flying disc, how did his career go? Usually in the military, when you do something that embarrasses the military, it tends to be pretty bad for your career. Well, how did he end up? 4-star general, vice chief of staff of the Air Force before he died apparently of natural causes of a heart attack in 1965 while still on duty. Didn't hurt his career. What about the general that wrote the memo to the Pentagon who said these are real and not fictitious or visionary? He went on for another star and became the first Air Force officer to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's not exactly what you generally do with a person that's considered to be a wacko. And you can go on. LeMay, of course, went on to be chief of staff of the Air Force. And you can go on with this whole subject like this. We also have the fact that when you look at the government reaction to for instance, NICAP, the UFO organization in the 50s and 60s, trying to get congressional hearings on the subject, what happens? It is absolutely fiercely fought the whole time. And then when it gets to the point, because of the incident involving the policeman and Michigan and the co-eds at Hillsdale College, of all things, interestingly, knowing their current reputation as a college, this led to ultimately to the Condon report, which, as I pointed before, was a whitewash. And then the Air Force put out an interesting memo, which has been their official position ever since, that these objects do not constitute a threat to national security, nor will continued study advance our technological progress, and therefore it's not our business. We're not interested anymore. Blue book closed, and that's that. However, Freedom of Information Act information from the late 70s suggests that that's not really the whole story. I mean, incidents such as a helicopter, quote, helicopter, I should say, over an Air Force base, a SAC Air Force base that was hovering over their nuclear weapons storage facility for several hours. Apparently was one of the reports that the Joint Chiefs received. Interesting, a helicopter. Apparently nobody ever determined where this helicopter came from and who violated national security restrictions in such a blatant way. Hard to believe that would be allowed to happen if it was just a, quote, helicopter. And so forth. I mean, we can go on and on and on and on and on about this sort of thing. The Rendlesham Forest case is another classic example, and so forth. But the point is, we see a continual attitude of cover up, and the question is, how is the secret being maintained? It is a serious claim or counter argument. My argument is that after the Roswell incident was publicized heavily, the mode went into the technique, what I call cover up in plain sight. The fact of the matter is, we all know all about this subject, really. I mean, whatever the layman would want to know about it anyhow, it's all well known. What we don't know is any of it true? We know a lot of details about what allegedly happened at Roswell, but we don't know if it's true. And you can go on with other incidents, right? All kinds of allegations of this and that, but is it true? Or is it just a lie? And by fuzzing things up, and also the way the media plays up the most outrageous claims of contactees, women having alien babies, you name it, the result is such a fuzz of disinformation and white noise around the core subject that it's easy to not believe any of it and just to write it all off as bunk. And yet, again, we get back to John Podesta, a person with high security clearance, who's said on leaving the Obama administration, his greatest regret was not being able to end UFO secrecy. Interesting. Dick Cheney, let's be a little bipartisan here. Early in his term as vice president, remembering he was also Secretary of Defense before becoming vice president, was asked about the UFO subject, and he seemed to be taken a little bit aback and said, I have nothing for you on that, and if I did, it would be classified. That's interesting. He didn't say, that's just a bunch of horse. I mean, I'm just saying, you get the feeling that there is something there. We even have the rather strange comments that we've had from people such as Bill Clinton, when being asked about the subject, sort of deflects and talks about stealth technology at Area 51. And then when asked directly if he knew, would he tell us? He says yes, but his head is shaking no. Interesting body language. Barack Obama, when asked about the subject, says, when asked about this, what Bill Clinton said, he responds in a very interesting way. He says, well, that's what they tell us to say. And then I think it's Jimmy Kimmel then asked him, says, well, if I was elected president, the first thing I would do is get the documents on this and find out all about it. And Barack Obama says, that's why you'll never be president. You can go on with this. There's also the Jimmy Carter stories. They allegedly had a briefing that left them all shook up about the subject. What about the President Reagan speech at the UN, which suggests that maybe if the aliens could be a threat, might lead to world unity and peace? And I mean, so you begin to get the idea that people who should be in the know about what the government knows obfuscate all the time and seem to be taking it on a level of seriousness that's a little bit different than our mainstream science community tends to. And if the point is, we say, well, where's the hard evidence? Well, if these crashes and these encounters really occurred, there is hard evidence. And there's a selected group of people who actually know, not speculate, know. And that's why when you have things such as the whole incident, about Eric Davis and Admiral Wilson, and Admiral Wilson's search to find out about this classified program and ends up being denied access, but is given a little bit of a story to whet his appetite and make him go away, being told, yeah, you're right, it is what you think it is, basically, but you're not going to be cleared for it, so go away. But this also shows the degree to which how would I put it? The secret is very compartmentalized, and probably within even the people that are on the inside, the details below that are even more subcompartmentalized. So the secret has been kept. One can ask yourself, why hasn't there been a Snowden on UFOs? Well, let me point out there haven't been many Snowdens on the NSA either, really, when you really get down to it. Very few people have pulled a Snowden, and currently he's in exile in Russia. So I would suggest that probably more selected and reliable people have been brought into this than Snowden was, because after all, the counterintelligence effort with respect to global terrorism and the like requires a lot more personnel than this other thing has. My guess is on the real situation is that we do probably have real evidence, and we probably have had some experts look at it, and we've concluded that this is incomprehensible to us beyond a certain superficial level. I mean, my view is that the technologies that would have to be involved if this is real, and that's like going out on a limb and saying there's some science we don't know, and that's led to technologies we can't comprehend. And if that's the case, my guess is certainly in the early 50s, we would have a complete tilt on even beginning to understand this. And probably from time to time, maybe they take another look at it with another team of very limited number of experts and come up with the same conclusions. And that's kind of where I think the situation lies. Because just imagine you took a piece of contemporary technology and put it at various points of time in the past. Take the laptop I'm making this video on and send it back to 1930s. I mean, could the government, could a team of experts reverse engineer this laptop in the 1930s? No, not at all. They probably couldn't even come close to making a basic computer at that point. They would be at somewhere on the level where Turing was in his effort on the British Ultra project in World War II, at best. And I mean, take an M16 back to the Civil War period and give it to the best armament people at the time, and President Lincoln says, reverse engineer me one of these. Could they do it? No. In fact, probably wasting their time trying to do it would probably be adverse to simply developing a basic repeating rifle using brass cartridges and black powder. It would be much more productive, right? So I think I can go on with these examples, but you get the idea. If we get our hands on the physical technologies, it's probably largely incomprehensible. If we have alien bodies, the study of their biology might actually become more relevant than anything else. The material technologies, as far as materials and alloys, I think that's something we could probably do some studies on. But as far as reverse engineering the propulsion technique, I don't know. It is definitely an idea for areas to work on. And that's probably where I kind of am also sort of interested, because one of my other interests is there any kind of advanced non-reaction type propulsion technology possible? Current science would basically say no. And there are a few people like Dr. Woodward and I guess Dr. Jack Sephardi also, who believe, well, maybe there is a possibility of extending current science to those possibilities. And Woodward at least does have an experiment, which he's now claiming is getting better results on. So we'll just have to wait and see how that pans out. But that's another reason why I do think this is interesting as an area to look at. And it's one of those sort of things. It's a high payoff if anything comes of it, and a marginal investment if it doesn't. So it's worth considering. At any rate, that sort of gives you my general overview of my attitude on the subject and where I'm coming from, and the basis of why I'm taking the attitude I have as a working hypothesis, let's call it, that we probably are dealing with some sort of extraterrestrial craft, for the lack of a better term. We don't really know where they would have come from, or it's really unclear what they're doing here. The presence does seem to be a little too extensive to be a casual visit, and yet the lack of overt contact leaves us wondering what are they up to. And that's also just a mystery. And hopefully things like To the Stars Academy and hopefully greater government investigations will lead to more information. However, the problem is right now, my thinking is that ATIP was not, if you will, the real program. As I've emphasized, this subject, I believe, is highly compartmentalized within the government. And interesting enough, the one organization that said very little about this whole subject at all is the United States Air Force. They were always the lead agency throughout the period from Roswell all the way through the end of Blue Book to address this subject. And yet all the revelations have come from this Navy issue, but the Air Force says nothing. And remember, the Air Force also has a lot of airplanes flying over the United States. Since 9/11, planes on alert. If you have your little private airplane that flies into some restricted space, you're allowed to be met with an F-15 or an F-16, very, very likely. And these planes are going to be armed, unlike what Commander Favors was. So, and certainly until the Air Defense Command was eliminated, for many years we had fighter jets well into the 80s on alert with weapons ready to intercept Russian bombers. Any kind of thing that would show up on the radar would cause a scramble, and intercepts were occurred, I assume. So we just don't know what the Air Force knows, but they seem to be the group that's very secretive. And I think the other group may be the CIA and the NSA, the hardcore intelligence community. We're not really hearing anything out of them either to speak of. When they have addressed the subject in recent years, they've tried to do things like, well, when we were testing our U-2 or our SR-71, that could have led to some sightings. So that's another example. But there's an area where there's a big veil of secrecy. There's also the possibility there's an entirely independent, currently classified entity that's been existed since the 40s that's simply still unacknowledged. After all, the NSA originally started as an unacknowledged agency created by executive order of President Truman. And the joke used to be for years it stood for no such agency. So, these kind of things are possible in the world of security. So I tend to think that the real issue I think you come down to is I question, did ATIP really have access to the core information that the government actually has at some level of security? I think that's a good question. I think they were created by a group of senators who were interested, and they operated under an umbrella of a little bit of deception, I'd even say. That is, Advanced Aerospace Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Anybody who wasn't on the inside of this would think it's just a threat working group effort to see what the Russians or Chinese might be putting out to threaten us with in the next 40 years, and what fundamental technology research we should be pursuing to counter that. I mean, after all, the studies that led to the current, like F-22, go back to 1980 at least. I think they're probably even precursors before that. But my direct involvement started in January of '82 when I was on that. So I'm just saying, and the plane became operational in 2005, and so you see the long lead times that fundamental research would be going through. But people on the inside knew it was really looking into UFOs, you see. So this is the way things can be hidden. And I think maybe a lot of things may have been hidden from ATIP as well. I don't think they may have had any more access than Admiral Wilson did. And so, anyway, that kind of sums up what my thought process on the subject. I think it is a worthy thing to look at. Um, and I'll also say there's probably a lot of nonsense going on around the subject. At the same time, you're dealing with something that involves what's often referred to as high strangeness. So perhaps some of the stuff even I'm totally unprepared to accept is real as well, or perhaps not. Anyway, that was in this video now. I don't want to go on forever, but I thought it'd be kind of useful to those that might be interested to kind of hear where I'm coming from. I mean, I'd like myself to be characterized in a fair manner as an objective, rational, scientific thinker, but at the same time, I think there's something to see there.